I'm 71 years old, and for 30 years, I tracked something the government didn't want found. Not drug cartels, not terrorists, something far more unsettling. My name is Benjamin Harlow, and I spent 3 decades as an FBI special agent assigned to what we internally called the Cryptid Intelligence Division. Yes, you heard that right. The FBI has a division dedicated to tracking Bigfoot, and what I discovered about their intelligence, about their society, about what they know about us, will fundamentally change how you see the world around you. It started in 1993. I was 38 years old, working organized crime out of the Seattle field office. I'd made my career taking down the Gambino family's West Coast operations, testimony that put away 17 made men. I was good at my job, patient, methodical, the kind of investigator who could spend months building a case, connecting dots others missed, which is probably why they chose me. It was October 14th, 1993. I remember because it was 3 days before my daughter's 8th birthday, and I'd been planning to take time off. My section chief, Raymond Torres, called me into his office at 6:47 in the evening. The sun was already setting over Puget Sound, casting long shadows through the office windows. Ray looked uncomfortable, which was unusual. He'd been FBI for 26 years, served in Vietnam before that. Not much rattled him. "Ben," he said, closing the door behind me, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. You can't discuss it with your wife, your partner, anyone. Before I brief you, I need your word." I studied his face. Ray and I had worked together for 7 years. I trusted him. "You have it." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer. The cover was stamped with classifications I'd never seen before. Not just top secret, something else, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. 3 weeks ago, a National Forest Service ranger disappeared in the North Cascades. Gregory Whitmore, age 42, 20 years experience. He was conducting a routine patrol in a remote section near Ross Lake. When he didn't check in, they sent a search team. What they found was his truck, his equipment, his radio, but no Gregory. Ray opened the folder. What they also found were footprints, 17 inches long, 5-toed bipedal gait pattern. And this, he handed me a photograph. Even now, decades later, I can see it perfectly. It showed a tree trunk, maybe 3 feet in diameter. The bark had been stripped away in a precise rectangular pattern, about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, and carved into the exposed wood in letters 6 inches tall were 2 words: "Stop looking." "English words," I said slowly. "Someone's playing a prank." That's what we thought too, until the lab analyzed it. Ray pulled out another document. The carving was done with something sharp, probably stone. The depth and angle of the cuts suggest incredible force far beyond normal human capability. And there's something else. He showed me another photo. This one was a close-up of the bark around the carving. There were fingerprints. Partial prints, but clear enough to analyze. Ray's voice dropped. "Ben, those prints don't match any known primate. The ridge patterns are similar to human, but the size, the spacing between the ridges, the overall structure, it's different. Significantly different." I looked at the photos, my mind trying to process what he was suggesting. "You're telling me Bigfoot is real and it can write. I'm telling you something in those mountains has been watching us, and it's smart enough to communicate, smart enough to know we're searching for something, smart enough to warn us off." The next morning, I was on a plane to Washington State, not Seattle, where I lived. Bellingham, a small town near the Canadian border. I was met at the airport by a man who introduced himself only as Dr. Chen. He was maybe 50, Chinese-American, with the careful way of speaking that suggested academia. "Agent Harlow," he said as we drove north in an unmarked SUV. "I'm with a research division you won't find on any organizational chart. We've been studying these beings for 47 years. Since 1946, shortly after the war ended, we know they exist. We know approximately how many there are. And we know they're watching us just as carefully as we're watching them. How many are there? In North America, we estimate between 200 and 300 individuals, scattered from Northern California through British Columbia, possibly some in the Rockies, though those sightings are less reliable. That's it? That's an extinction-level population. Exactly, which is why this situation is so delicate. Dr. Chen turned onto a logging road, the SUV bouncing over ruts. What I'm about to show you stays between us and about 12 other people in the entire government. If this gets out, if the public learns what we know, there will be hunting parties, trophy seekers, crypto enthusiasts with rifles and cameras. These beings have survived by remaining hidden. We're trying to keep it that way. We drove for another 40 minutes deep into the Cascades. The road eventually became little more than a trail, and we had to continue on foot. Dr. Chen led me through dense forest, following markers I couldn't see, until we reached a small clearing, and there, set up like some kind of research station, were 3 tents, monitoring equipment, and 4 people in civilian clothes who looked ex-military. "This is Forward Station 7, Dr. Chen explained. We have 11 of these throughout their known range. We monitor movement patterns, vocalizations, and most importantly, we document behavior." He gestured to a woman sitting in front of a bank of monitors. "That's Dr. Sarah Keating. She's our lead behavioral specialist." Dr. Keating looked up as we approached. She was maybe 35, with short red hair and the intense focus of someone who'd found their life's work. "Agent Harlow, welcome to the most fascinating assignment you'll ever have." She pointed to one of the monitors. "This footage was recorded 2 nights ago, about 6 miles from here. The video was grainy, shot in infrared, but I could see clearly enough. A massive figure, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, was moving through the forest. But what caught my attention wasn't the creature itself. It was what it was doing. It was carrying something. As I watched, it stopped near a tree, set down its burden, and began arranging objects on the ground. Stones, I realized. It was arranging stones in a pattern, a deliberate geometric pattern. "Keep watching," Dr. Keating said. The creature worked for several minutes, placing stones with what looked like careful consideration. When it finished, it stepped back, observed its work, then picked up what it had been carrying and moved on. "What was it carrying?" I asked. "We're not sure. But we found sites like this before. Stone arrangements that serve no obvious practical purpose. We believe they're territorial markers. But not just markers." Dr. Keating pulled up another image on a different monitor. "Look at this." It was a photograph of stone arrangements from different locations. And as I looked at them, I saw it. They weren't random. They were similar, variations on a theme, but clearly related. "They're using a consistent system," Dr. Keating said. "Different groups have slightly different styles, but there's an underlying structure. Agent Harlow, this is language. Not spoken language, but visual language. They're leaving messages for each other." Over the next 3 days, Dr. Chen and his team showed me everything they'd learned. Video footage of family groups, massive adults caring for young ones that were still 5 or 6 feet tall, audio recordings of vocalizations that had patterns, structure, syntax, and most disturbing, evidence that these beings had been actively avoiding human contact for generations. "They know about cameras," Dr. Chen explained on my 3rd day there. "Watch this." He played a video from a trail camera. A Bigfoot approached, walking upright, with a gait that was almost human, but not quite. It stopped about 20 feet from the camera, stared directly at it for several seconds, then reached down, picked up a handful of dirt, and threw it with perfect accuracy. The camera lens went black. "They've done this 47 times at various stations," Dr. Chen said. They know what cameras are, they know we're watching, and they're intelligent enough to disable our surveillance when they choose to. That night, lying in my assigned tent at the research station, I couldn't sleep. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world had been upended. These beings weren't just animals, they were people. Different from us, yes, but conscious, intelligent, aware. The next morning, Dr. Chen approached me with a serious expression. "Agent Harlow, I need to show you something. Something that will explain why your presence here is so critical." We hiked for an hour to a location I later learned was designated Site 43. It was a small cave, barely visible behind a curtain of vegetation. Dr. Chen pulled back the vines and gestured for me to enter. Inside, the cave opened into a larger space, and covering the walls were drawings, hundreds of them, pictographs showing figures that were clearly Bigfoot, but also figures that were clearly human. And these weren't ancient drawings. Some were obviously old, weathered, and faded, but others were fresh, the charcoal still dark against the stone. "This is a generational chronicle," Dr. Chen said softly, his voice echoing in the cave. "We've carbon dated some of the older drawings. They go back at least 800 years, maybe more. This particular group has been in these mountains for centuries, and they've been documenting their encounters with humans the entire time." He pointed to a section of drawings that showed human figures with what looked like weapons. "These are from the 1800s, we think. They show conflicts, humans hunting them. See these here?" He indicated drawings of smaller Bigfoot figures lying down. "We believe these represent deaths, killings." I moved closer, examining the pictographs. The level of detail was extraordinary. The human figures weren't just stick figures, they had clothing, tools, expressions. Whoever created these understood not just what humans looked like, but how they behaved. "Now look at these," Dr. Chen said, pointing to a more recent section. "These were added in the last 20 years. The drawings showed humans with cameras, with vehicles, with what looked like buildings. And there were numbers, crude but unmistakable, tallies, counts. They're tracking us," I said. "Our population growth, our expansion into their territory. Yes, and there's more." Dr. Chen pointed to the most recent drawings, barely a year old. "These show something we didn't expect. The drawings depicted a group of Bigfoot, maybe 6 or 7 figures gathered in what looked like a meeting, and facing them were human figures, not hunting, not threatening, just standing as if in conversation. This drawing was made about 14 months ago," Dr. Chen said, "right around the time we established this forward station. Agent Harlow, they know we're here. They know we're different from hunters or loggers. And I believe this drawing represents a decision they made, a decision about whether to make contact." "Contact? You mean communicate directly?" "That's exactly what I mean. And that's why you're here." Dr. Chen turned to face me fully. "Something has changed in the last year. They've become more bold, more visible. The carved message on that tree wasn't random. It was directed at us specifically, at our research team. They're testing us, seeing how we respond. And the Bureau believes, and I agree, that we may be approaching a pivotal moment. First contact between human intelligence and another sapient species that evolved right here on Earth." I looked at the drawings again, trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. If they make contact, if they reveal themselves, what happens? That's the question keeping me awake at night. Dr. Chen sat down on a flat rock, suddenly looking very tired. "If it becomes public knowledge that Bigfoot exists, that they're intelligent, that there are maybe 300 of them left, what do you think happens? Best case scenario, they become a protected species. We establish preserves, limit human access to their territories, try to help their population recover. Worst case?" He shook his head. "Trophy hunters, capture attempts, people who see them as either threats or opportunities. Their survival has depended on secrecy. Breaking that secrecy could doom them. So what's the Bureau's position? Officially, we don't acknowledge they exist. Unofficially, we protect them by keeping them hidden. We monitor their population. We try to prevent harmful encounters. And we wait for them to decide what they want. If they want to remain hidden, we help them do that. If they want contact, we try to facilitate it in the safest way possible. Your job, Agent Harlow, is to be ready for either scenario. That was 30 years ago, and everything Dr. Chen told me that day proved to be true. I spent the next 3 decades of my life working in what became the most classified, most bizarre, most profound assignment in law enforcement history. I tracked beings that weren't supposed to exist. I documented a society that operated by rules we barely understood. And I slowly, piece by piece, came to realize that these creatures knew more about us than we could ever imagine. What I'm about to tell you is the full story of those 30 years, the discoveries we made, the close encounters that almost went wrong, the intelligence we documented, and the moment just 3 years ago when everything changed, when they finally made the decision we'd been waiting for, and when I learned the truth about why they'd been watching us so carefully for so long. The answer was more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. Part 1 of my story begins 6 months after that first briefing in April of 1994. I'd been officially transferred to what my paperwork called Resource Protection Detail, a deliberately vague title that could mean almost anything. My family thought I was investigating environmental crimes, illegal logging, that sort of thing. They had no idea. I'd been living at Forward Station 7 for 3 weeks, the longest continuous deployment yet. We'd been tracking a family group, what Dr. Keating called the Cascade Clan. 2 adults, 1 juvenile, and 1 infant. They'd been ranging through a territory of about 40 square miles, moving in patterns that suggested they were following seasonal food sources. It was April 19th, around 10 in the evening. I was reviewing audio files when Dr. Keating burst into the monitoring tent. "Ben, you need to see this. Live feed, camera 14. I followed her to the monitors. Camera 14 was positioned in a small clearing about 2 miles from our station, and there, illuminated by infrared, were 3 of them, the 2 adults and the juvenile. But they weren't foraging or traveling, they were gathered around something. "Zoom in," I said. Dr. Keating adjusted the camera, and my breath caught. They were gathered around a structure, something they'd built. It was crude but deliberate, a framework of branches and bark that formed a kind of shelter. But what made my heart pound was what was inside the shelter. "Tools," Dr. Keating whispered. "They've made tools." I could see them clearly now. Sharpened sticks, rocks that had been worked into cutting edges, and something that looked like a primitive basket, woven from thin branches. "We've never documented tool creation this sophisticated," Dr. Keating said, her voice shaking with excitement. "Basic tool use, yes. Breaking branches, using rocks to crack nuts. But this is craftsmanship, this is planning, this is technology." As we watched, the larger adult, probably the male based on size, picked up one of the sharpened sticks and demonstrated something to the juvenile. A technique, a teaching moment. The juvenile watched carefully, then took the stick and imitated the motion. The adult made a sound, a vocalization we'd heard before but couldn't decipher, and the juvenile tried again. Better this time. "He's teaching," I said. "That's deliberate instruction, passing on knowledge." Dr. Keating was already recording everything, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Do you understand what we're seeing? This is culture. This is generational knowledge transfer. This is," her voice cracked slightly, "this is humanity, just not human." We watched for 3 hours that night as the family group worked with their tools, improved their shelter, and communicated with each other through a combination of vocalizations and gestures. Dr. Keating documented 17 distinct vocalizations, each used in specific contexts, 6 different gestures that clearly had meaning, and 5 instances of what she called collaborative problem solving, where 2 or more of them worked together to accomplish something neither could do alone. At 1 in the morning, Dr. Chen arrived after we'd called him with an update. He watched the footage in silence, his face grave. "Tomorrow morning, first light, we're going to that site. We need to see those tools up close. But Ben, this changes everything. If we can document this level of intelligence, this level of cultural complexity, we have a moral obligation to protect them, not as animals, as people." We set out at 5:30 in the morning, just as the first gray light was filtering through the canopy. Dr. Chen, Dr. Keating, myself, and 2 security specialists named Rodriguez and Kim. We moved slowly, carefully, following the GPS coordinates to the clearing where we'd observed the family group the night before. The morning air was cold, maybe 40 degrees, and our breath came out in visible puffs. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, the distant rush of a stream. When we reached the clearing, the family group was gone, but what they'd left behind took my breath away. The shelter stood exactly as we'd seen it on camera, but somehow more impressive in person. It was roughly 6 feet tall and maybe 8 feet across, constructed from interwoven branches that had been carefully selected and positioned. The structure showed planning, an understanding of weight distribution and stability that went far beyond instinct. Dr. Keating approached slowly, her camera recording everything. "Look at the joints," she said, pointing to where branches connected. "They've been bound together with stripped bark, twisted into cordage. That's rope making. That's understanding material properties." Inside the shelter, the tools remained. Dr. Chen knelt beside them, pulling on latex gloves before touching anything. He picked up one of the sharpened sticks, examining it in the growing daylight. "The point has been worked against stone. You can see the scrape marks. And look here," he turned it to show me, "they've hardened it in fire. See the charring? This isn't just a stick they picked up. This is a manufactured tool." Rodriguez, one of the security specialists, was examining the perimeter of the clearing. "Dr. Chen, you need to see this." We gathered around what Rodriguez had found. Pressed into the soft earth near the shelter were footprints, fresh ones probably from the night before. But what made them significant was their arrangement. They formed a clear pattern, a semicircle around the shelter with regular spacing between each print. "They were standing watch," Kim said quietly, "posted guards while the others worked." "That implies organization," I said, "division of labor, security awareness." Dr. Keating was photographing everything, her excitement barely contained. "We need to establish a pattern. How often do they use sites like this? Do they return to the same locations? Are these temporary camps or more permanent settlements?" Over the next 3 months, we documented 7 more tool-making sites. Each one showed increasing sophistication. At Site 19, we found what could only be described as a workshop. Dozens of tools in various stages of completion, different types for different purposes. Cutting tools, digging tools, tools we couldn't immediately identify the purpose of. And in the center of the site, a flat stone that showed clear evidence of repeated use as a work surface. But it was at Site 23 where we made the discovery that changed everything. It was July 12, 1994. Scorching summer day, rare for the Cascades, but the heat had settled in for a week. We were investigating a location that our audio monitoring had indicated was frequently visited by what we believed was a different family group, one we designated the Northern Clan. The site was in a shallow cave, protected from the elements, and covering the walls were more pictographs. But these weren't like the ones Dr. Chen had first shown me. These were different, more complex, more detailed. Dr. Keating stood in the entrance, her hand over her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ben, these aren't just records. These are lessons." I moved closer to examine what she was seeing. The pictographs showed a sequence, a clear progression of images that told a story. The first image showed a Bigfoot figure with what looked like a small animal. The next showed the figure using a tool. The third showed the result, the animal prepared for eating. And beneath each image were marks, tally marks, numbers. "It's an instructional manual," Dr. Chen said, his voice filled with wonder. "They're teaching their young how to hunt, how to prepare food, and they're using numbers to indicate quantity, time, sequence. We documented everything, spending 6 hours in that cave. We found teaching pictographs for tool making, for finding water, for identifying safe and unsafe plants, for building shelters. It was, in every sense of the word, a textbook, a curriculum passed down through generations. But what disturbed me, what kept me awake that night, was a series of pictographs near the back of the cave. These showed human figures, lots of them, and they showed something else. They showed the Bigfoot population shrinking. The images were stark, almost mathematical in their presentation. Many Bigfoot in the early drawings, fewer in the middle drawings, very few in the most recent ones. "They know they're going extinct," Dr. Keating said quietly, standing beside me as I studied the images. "They're documenting their own decline, and they know we're the reason." The pictographs showed it clearly: human expansion, forests being cut down, roads being built, and with each image of human growth, fewer Bigfoot figures. They'd been watching us for generations, watching their world shrink as ours expanded, and they'd been recording it all, leaving a testament to what was being lost. That night, back at Forward Station 7, I wrote my first classified report to FBI headquarters. I detailed everything we'd found: the tools, the teaching sites, the mathematical understanding, the cultural knowledge transfer, and I made a recommendation that I knew would be controversial. These beings possessed demonstrable intelligence, equal to or exceeding that of early human societies, I wrote. They have language, culture, technology, and historical consciousness. They are aware of their own mortality both as individuals and as a species. Under any reasonable definition, they qualify as persons. And as persons, they deserve protection under law, not as endangered animals, but as an indigenous population with inherent rights. The response came back 3 days later, a phone call from Assistant Director Mitchell. "In Washington, D.C., Agent Harlow, your report has caused quite a stir. We've had meetings with Interior, with the National Science Foundation, with people whose titles I can't even mention. Everyone agrees your findings are significant, but the question of legal personhood, that's complicated. That's beyond Bureau authority. That's potentially a Supreme Court matter. Sir, with respect, every day we delay this decision is another day they're unprotected. If a hunter kills one, what's the charge? If a developer destroys their habitat, what's the recourse?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "Agent Harlow, keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Build an airtight case. Because if we're going to ask the government to recognize another species as legal persons, we need evidence that no court in the world could refute." So that became my mission. For the next 5 years, from 1994 to 1999, I led a research team that compiled the most comprehensive documentation of non-human intelligence ever assembled. We recorded over 3,000 hours of vocalizations and identified what Dr. Keating estimated was a vocabulary of at least 200 distinct sounds, each with specific meaning. We documented 147 different tool types across 12 different family groups. We found teaching sites, burial sites where they laid their dead with ceremony and marking, and what could only be called art, cave paintings and wood carvings that served no practical purpose but existed purely for aesthetic expression. And we learned their patterns. We learned that they lived in extended family groups, usually 5 to 8 individuals. We learned that they migrated seasonally, following food sources with roots that had probably been used for thousands of years. We learned that different clans had different cultures, different tool-making styles, different artistic traditions. We were documenting not just a species, but a civilization. But we also learned something darker, something that made the urgency of our work even more critical. In January of 1999, I was tracking the Cascade clan, the same family group we'd first observed with their tool-making. We'd been monitoring them for 5 years now, watching the juvenile grow into a young adult, watching the infant become a juvenile. They were like distant relatives we checked in on regularly, their lives unfolding parallel to our observation. On January 23rd, our audio monitoring picked up something unusual, vocalizations from the Cascade clan's territory, but different, distressed, urgent. Dr. Keating and I hiked to their location, moving as quickly as we could through snow-covered forest. What we found there shattered whatever objectivity I'd managed to maintain. The female, the mother we'd watched care for her young for 5 years, was dead. She lay in a small clearing, her body already cold, and around her the rest of the family group had gathered. The male, the 2 juveniles. They weren't just standing there, they were engaged in what could only be called mourning. The male sat beside her, one massive hand resting on her shoulder. He was making sounds, low and mournful, that carried through the winter air. The juveniles stood nearby, occasionally approaching to touch their mother, then retreating. And as we watched from concealment 200 yards away, the male began to do something extraordinary. He started gathering stones, large ones, each probably 40 or 50 pounds. He carried them, one by one, and placed them around her body. He worked for hours, constructing a cairn, a burial mound. The juveniles helped, bringing smaller stones, arranging them carefully. They were building a grave. Dr. Keating was crying silently beside me, tears running down her face. "They're burying her," she whispered, "with ceremony, with intention. Ben, this is grief, this is love. This is everything that makes us human, existing in them." We watched until darkness fell. The family group didn't leave their mother's side. They stayed through the night, keeping vigil, and in the morning, when the cairn was complete, they did something I'll never forget. They each approached the grave, placed a hand on the stones, and made a vocalization. The same sound, repeated by each of them in turn. A farewell, a prayer, an acknowledgement of loss. Then they left, moving north, away from a territory they'd occupied for years. We never saw the Cascade clan in that area again. I included this observation in my next report, along with Dr. Keating's behavioral analysis, the evidence of grief, of ritual, of emotional complexity, and I included something else, a question that had been gnawing at me for months. If these beings possess all the markers of personhood, if they grieve and love and create and teach, then what is the moral difference between them and us? And if there is no meaningful difference, what does that make us when we allow them to slide toward extinction through our indifference? The response from headquarters was unexpected. Assistant Director Mitchell called personally. "Agent Harlow, pack your things. You're needed in Washington. We're briefing the President." Washington, D.C., in February of 1999, was cold and gray, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones. I arrived at FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying a briefcase containing 6 years of documentation, video footage, audio recordings, photographic evidence, behavioral analyses, everything we'd compiled, Everything that proved what I was about to tell the most powerful people in the world. The briefing took place in a secure conference room, 3 levels below ground. Present were Assistant Director Mitchell, 2 advisors from the National Security Council, the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, 3 scientists I didn't recognize, and Dr. Chen, who'd been flown in from Seattle. We waited in uncomfortable silence until exactly 10 in the morning, when the door opened and President Clinton entered, followed by the Vice President and the White House Chief of Staff. The President looked tired, but his eyes were sharp as he took his seat at the head of the table. Agent Harlow, I've read your reports. All of them. I've watched some of the footage. And I have to tell you, this is the most extraordinary situation I've encountered in 6 years in this office. He leaned forward. So I need you to tell me, in your professional opinion, based on 6 years of direct observation, what exactly are we dealing with? I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single photograph. It showed the Cascade clan family gathered around their mother's cairn. Mr. President, I said, we are dealing with people. Not human people, but people nonetheless. They possess language with complex syntax. They create and use sophisticated tools. They pass cultural knowledge across generations through teaching. They engage in artistic expression. They bury their dead with ceremony. They grieve. They love. They are aware of their own existence and their place in the world. By every measure we use to define consciousness and personhood, they qualify. One of the NSC advisors, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, spoke up. Agent Harlow, the implications of what you're suggesting are staggering. If we acknowledge these beings as persons, we're talking about land rights, legal protections, potentially even political representation. We're talking about redefining what it means to be a citizen. I'm not suggesting they need to vote or pay taxes, I replied. I'm suggesting they have the right to exist without being hunted or displaced. The right to live in their ancestral territories without fear of extermination. Basic rights that we would afford to any sapient being. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. Mr. President, if I may, there's another factor to consider. Based on our population estimates and genetic studies, these beings are critically endangered. We estimate 200 to 300 individuals across their entire range. That's below the minimum viable population for long-term survival. Even with protection, they may be facing extinction within a century. Without protection, within decades. The room fell silent. The president looked at each person around the table, then back at me. What do you recommend? Create a classified protection program, I said. Expand the forward stations. Increase monitoring. Establish formal protocols for preventing harmful human Bigfoot encounters. And most importantly, prepare the legal and scientific framework for eventual public disclosure. Because, Mr. President, these beings are becoming bolder. The carved warning we found 6 years ago wasn't an isolated incident. We've found 17 more since then. They're aware we're studying them. And I believe they're deciding whether to make contact on their terms. When that happens, and I believe it will, we need to be ready. The president was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Make it happen. Whatever resources you need, you have them. But this stays classified at the highest levels. If this leaks before we're ready, before we have proper protections in place, it could be catastrophic for them. He stood, and everyone else rose with him. Agent Harlow, you've done extraordinary work. Keep doing it. These beings, wherever they came from, whatever they are, they're under our protection now. Over the next 15 years, from 1999 to 2014, the program expanded dramatically. We went from 3 forward stations to 22. We went from a team of 12 people to nearly 200, though most never knew the full scope of what they were protecting, only that certain areas were off limits for reasons of national security. We prevented 4 separate attempts by private organizations to mount expeditions searching for Bigfoot. We quietly acquired land through federal purchases and conservation easements, creating protected corridors through their territories. We worked with the Canadian government to establish similar protections north of the border, and we continued to learn. In 2003, we documented what Dr. Keating called the most significant discovery since the teaching caves. We found evidence of inter-clan cooperation, 3 different family groups, representing 3 distinct cultural traditions based on their tool-making styles, working together to accomplish something none could do alone. They were constructing a bridge across a swollen river, using logs and vines to create a crossing that would remain usable for years. It was engineering, it was collaboration across cultural boundaries, it was civilization. In 2007, we recorded vocalizations that, when analyzed, showed mathematical concepts, counting certainly, but also ratios and proportions. They were teaching their young not just to count, but to calculate. And in 2011, we found something that changed my understanding of their relationship with us entirely. I was investigating a site in the Olympic Mountains, following up on reports of unusual activity from one of our remote cameras. It was September 21st, 2011. I was 56 years old then, feeling every year in my knees as I hiked through the rain-soaked forest. The site was another cave, smaller than the teaching caves we'd found before, but inside were pictographs that took my breath away. These weren't teaching tools. These weren't historical records. These were recent observations, detailed observations of us. The drawings showed human technology in remarkable detail. Vehicles with accurate wheel configurations, helicopters with correct rotor placement, buildings with proper architectural elements, and alongside each drawing were symbols, their written language, annotating what they were seeing. "They've been studying us," I breathed, my flashlight playing across the images just as carefully as we've been studying them. But what made my blood run cold were the drawings near the back of the cave. These showed something different. They showed what looked like environmental destruction, forests being cleared, rivers being polluted, mountains being stripped bare, and they showed the result: animals fleeing, plants dying, and in the final image, human figures looking distressed, suffering. They understand cause and effect, I realized. They understand that we're destroying our own habitat, and they're documenting it as a warning. I took extensive photographs, documented everything, and returned to Forward Station 7. Dr. Keating, now the lead director of the entire program, reviewed my findings with growing concern. "Ben, these pictographs are dated. Look at these marker symbols here. Based on our understanding of their calendar system, these were created over the last 3 years. They're actively monitoring our environmental impact." And I think she paused, studying the images more carefully. "I think they're trying to figure out how to warn us." "Why would they care?" I asked. "We're the species that's pushed them to the edge of extinction." Dr. Keating pulled up a map on her computer, showing the distribution of Bigfoot territories. "Look at where they live. The last remaining old-growth forests, the watersheds that supply water to millions of people, the carbon sinks that regulate our climate. Ben, they don't just live in the wilderness, they live in the parts of the wilderness that are most critical to planetary health. If those areas are destroyed, if they go extinct, it's not just them that suffers, it's all of us." Over the next 3 years, I noticed a pattern in their behavior that supported Dr. Keating's theory. They were spending more time near the boundaries of human development, not approaching people directly but watching, observing, and at sites near logging operations, near mining projects, near any human activity that threatened the forest, we found pictographs. Always the same theme. This destruction leads to suffering. This path leads to extinction. Not just their extinction, everyone's. By 2014, I was 59 years old and had spent 21 years tracking them. I knew their patterns, their territories, their cultural variations. I could identify individual clan members by their vocalizations and movement patterns. They were no longer subjects of study to me. They were neighbors. Distant neighbors who I worried about constantly. That's when things accelerated. On October 3rd, 2014, one of our cameras captured something unprecedented. A Bigfoot, a large male we'd been tracking for years, approached the camera directly. He didn't disable it. He stood in front of it, looked directly into the lens, and held up a stick. On the stick were carved symbols, their written language, and he held it there for a full 30 seconds before walking away. Dr. Keating spent 2 days analyzing the symbols with linguistic consultants we'd brought into the program. When she called me into her office, her face was pale. "Ben, we've translated it. It's a message. It says in their symbol system, time to talk." The moment we'd been anticipating for over 2 decades had arrived. They were ready for contact. The question was, were we? I spent the next 3 months preparing. We assembled a contact team. Myself, Dr. Keating, Dr. Chen, now 72 years old, but insisting on being part of this, a linguistic specialist named Dr. James Reeves, and 2 security personnel who'd been part of the program for over a decade. We developed protocols, how to approach, how to communicate, what to offer, what to expect. On January 15th, 2015, we initiated first contact. We chose a site in the North Cascades, a clearing where we'd documented regular activity from the clan we believed had sent the message. We arrived at dawn carrying no weapons, only supplies, food as an offering, blank paper and charcoal for communication, and a simple white flag, the universal human symbol of peaceful intentions. We waited for 6 hours. The sun rose higher, warming the cold January air. Birds returned to their normal activity, apparently unconcerned by our presence. And then, just after noon, they appeared. 3 of them. 2 large adults, probably male based on size, and 1 smaller individual, possibly female or a young adult. They emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, moving with a confidence that suggested they'd been watching us for some time. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The largest of the 3, easily 9 feet tall with graying hair around the shoulders, took a step forward. He raised one massive hand, palm forward, in a gesture that could have been either greeting or a signal to stop. Then he vocalized, a long, modulating sound that echoed across the clearing. Dr. Reeves was recording everything. "That's a formal greeting vocalization," he whispered. "Respond. Mirror it." I took a breath and attempted to recreate the sound. It came out rough, my vocal anatomy not quite suited to their range, but close enough. The large male tilted his head, an unmistakably curious gesture, then made another sound, shorter, different in tone. "He's acknowledging your attempt," Dr. Reeves translated. "Continue. Use the symbols." I knelt down, keeping my movements slow and non-threatening, and picked up one of the pieces of charcoal. On the white paper we'd brought, I drew the symbol we'd learned meant friend. Then the symbol for talk. And finally the symbol for learn. The large male watched intently. Then he approached, closing the distance between us to maybe 20 feet. He stopped, knelt down in a mirror of my posture, and extended one hand, pointing to the paper. He wanted to respond. I slid the paper and charcoal across the ground toward him. He picked up the charcoal carefully, his massive fingers surprisingly deft, and began to draw, not symbols, pictures. He drew a human figure clearly meant to represent me. He drew a Bigfoot figure representing himself, and he drew them standing side by side, looking at a third image, a tree. "We both care for this," Dr. Keating breathed. "That's what he's saying, the forest, the world. We share it." The large male set down the charcoal and made another vocalization. Then he did something that made my eyes water. He placed his hand over his chest, then extended it toward me. The same gesture we'd seen at the burial ceremony 5 years earlier. A gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of connection. I mirrored the gesture, placing my hand over my heart, then extending it toward him. For a moment, two intelligent species, separated by millions of years of evolution, but connected by consciousness and care for the world we shared, looked at each other with understanding. That first contact lasted 3 hours. We communicated through drawings, through gestures, through Dr. Reeves's attempts at their vocalizations. And what emerged was clear. They wanted what we wanted, protection for their dwindling population, preservation of the forests they depended on, and something else, something that surprised me. They wanted to help us. They'd been watching human civilization for centuries, watching us make the same mistakes over and over, destroying the resources we needed to survive, polluting the air and water, driving species to extinction, not understanding that we were part of the same web of life that would collapse if too many threads were cut. They'd seen empires rise and fall. They'd watched the indigenous peoples of North America live in balance with nature for thousands of years, then watched European colonization bring destruction and exploitation. They'd observed the Industrial Revolution, the population explosion, the accelerating environmental crisis, and they'd come to a decision. If they revealed themselves, if they shared what they knew about living sustainably in these forests, maybe, just maybe, they could help humanity avoid the extinction they were facing themselves. That contact in January 2015 was the first of many. Over the next 3 years, I met with them 17 more times, each meeting built on the previous one. They showed us plants we didn't know had medicinal properties. They demonstrated water purification techniques using natural materials. They taught us about forest management practices that sustained rather than depleted, and they told us their history. Through pictographs and patient teaching, they showed us a lineage that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. They were, in a very real sense, the keepers of ancient knowledge, knowledge about living in harmony with the natural world that humanity had largely forgotten. But they also told us something that haunted me. They showed us pictographs of their population over time. Once, they said, through symbols and images, there were thousands, maybe tens of thousands. They'd ranged across all of North America from coast to coast. But as human population grew, as forests were cleared, as habitats were destroyed, their numbers dwindled. And now the pictographs showed with stark clarity they were the last. The final few clans clinging to existence in the remaining wilderness. In 2017, I was 62 years old. I'd spent 24 years in the program. My daughter was grown, had children of her own. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, cancer taking her before I could tell her the truth about what I'd really been doing all those years. And I was tired of keeping secrets, tired of watching a species face extinction while the world remained unaware. That's when they made their decision. The decision I'd been told to prepare for back in 1999, during our 18th contact meeting in May of 2017. The elder of the Northern Clan, the same large male who'd approached me during first contact, drew something new. He drew human figures, many of them. He drew Bigfoot figures, just a few. And then he drew them together, not separate. Together, facing what looked like an environmental catastrophe, fire and flood and devastation. We survive together or die separately, Dr. Keating interpreted from his symbols. He's saying they want to go public. They want humanity to know they exist. I looked at the elder, this magnificent being who represented an entire evolutionary lineage, and I understood the weight of what he was proposing. "If you reveal yourselves," I said, knowing he couldn't understand English but hoping my tone would convey my concern, "there will be chaos, fear. Some humans will want to protect you, others will want to exploit you. Are you ready for that?" The elder looked at me with those deep, intelligent eyes. Then he drew one more image, a human child and a Bigfoot child standing side by side, looking at a healthy forest. Future, he seemed to be saying, hope. I spent the next 3 months fighting the bureaucracy. The program had grown over the years, had layers of oversight, committees, review boards. Everyone had an opinion on whether the time was right for disclosure. Some argued it would cause panic, others worried about the legal implications. Still others feared it would trigger a hunting frenzy. But in August of 2017, the decision was taken out of our hands. A hiker in the Olympic Mountains, a wildlife photographer named Michael Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, captured footage. Not blurry, not ambiguous. Crystal clear video of a Bigfoot family group, shot from a concealed position with a high-quality camera. He posted it online before anyone could stop him. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed 50 million times. The world knew. The chaos I'd predicted came to pass. News crews descended on the Pacific Northwest. Hunting parties organized despite emergency protection orders. Scientists demanded access. Cryptozoologists claimed vindication. Religious leaders debated the theological implications. Politicians argued about jurisdiction and rights. But something else happened too, something I didn't expect. The public outcry for protection was overwhelming. Millions of people suddenly aware that we shared the planet with another intelligent species demanded action. Children wrote letters to Congress. Environmental groups filed lawsuits. The United Nations called emergency sessions. And in October of 2017, President Trump, despite my personal disagreements with many of his policies, signed the Sasquatch Protection Act. It designated all known Bigfoot territories as protected reserves. It made killing or harming them a federal crime equivalent to murder. It allocated funding for conservation and research. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I retired from the FBI in January of 2018 after 25 years in the program. But I didn't stop working. I joined the newly formed Sasquatch Conservation Council, a joint effort between the U.S. and Canadian governments to coordinate protection efforts. Today, in 2025, the population has stabilized at around 400 individuals. It's still critically endangered, but genetic diversity programs and habitat protection are giving them a fighting chance. And they're teaching us about sustainable forestry, about plant medicine, about living in balance with the natural world. My story, the 30 years I spent tracking them, learning from them, advocating for them, is now part of the official record. The classified files have been declassified. The videos and audio recordings are being studied by researchers around the world. And the pictographs, those beautiful, heartbreaking records of a species watching humanity from the shadows, are being preserved as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. What I discovered about their intelligence wasn't just that they're smart, it's that they're wise in ways we've forgotten. They understand something fundamental that modern civilization has lost, that we're not separate from nature. We're part of it. And when we destroy it, we destroy ourselves. The elder of the Northern Clan, the one who first approached me all those years ago, died last winter. He was old, probably close to 60 by their standards. I attended his burial ceremony, one of a handful of humans ever invited to such an event. His family built a cairn, just as I'd witnessed with the Cascade clan decades before. And they sang those deep, resonant vocalizations that carry for miles through the forest, songs of remembrance, songs of gratitude, songs of hope. As I stood there in that cold December forest, watching them honor their dead, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The carved warning that started it all, the tools and teaching caves, the pictographs documenting our destructive path, the first contact, the decision to reveal themselves despite the risks. And I understood something profound. They didn't make contact because they needed us to save them, though they did need that. They made contact because we needed them to save us, to remind us of what we'd forgotten, to show us that intelligence without wisdom leads only to destruction. But there's one part of the story I haven't told yet. One discovery that even now, years after disclosure, remains classified at the highest levels. Something I learned in my final months of active service that changed everything I thought I understood about their intelligence. It was November of 2017, just weeks before I retired. I received an urgent call from Dr. Keating. "Ben, you need to get to Site 43 immediately. The teaching cave. We found something that doesn't make sense." I drove through the night, arriving at dawn. Dr. Keating was waiting with a team of linguists and archaeologists we'd brought into the program after disclosure. The look on her face told me this was serious. She led me into the cave, past the familiar teaching pictographs we'd documented years before, to a section in the very back that had been concealed behind a rockfall. Recent seismic activity had shifted the stones, revealing a hidden chamber, and inside that chamber, covering every surface, were pictographs unlike anything we'd ever seen. They were mathematical, Dr. Reeves explained, his voice shaking with excitement. But not just counting or basic geometry. These are astronomical calculations, planetary orbits, lunar cycles, star positions. Ben, these calculations are accurate, precise. They show an understanding of celestial mechanics that shouldn't be possible without instruments. I studied the images, my flashlight revealing layer upon layer of careful observations. There were depictions of the night sky at different times of year, notations of eclipses, tracking of planetary movements, and in the center of it all, a large pictograph showing the solar system, all the planets in their correct orbital positions, including planets that weren't discovered by human science until the space age. "How long have these been here?" I asked. Dr. Keating pointed to the dating markers, based on their calendar system and cross-referencing with other dated sites. "We estimate these observations span at least 1,200 years. Ben, they've been watching the sky for over a millennium, recording, calculating, understanding." One of the archaeologists, a woman named Dr. Lisa Tran, pointed to a series of symbols near the bottom of the chamber. "We've translated these. They're not just observations, they're predictions, eclipse predictions, planetary alignments, and they're accurate to within hours." But it was what I saw next that made my blood run cold. In the deepest part of the chamber, protected from the elements, was a pictograph showing Earth, our planet clearly recognizable, and around it a series of calculations. Numbers and symbols we'd learned represented climate patterns, temperature changes, environmental cycles. "They've been tracking climate change," Dr. Keating said quietly, "for centuries, long before we had the instruments to measure it. They've watched the seasons shift, the ice patterns change, the forests migrate, and they've recorded it all." I approached the pictograph, studying the data they'd compiled over generations. The pattern was clear, gradual changes over most of their recorded history, but then, in the last 200 years, a sharp acceleration. The warming they'd documented matched precisely what modern climate science had only recently confirmed. "They knew," I whispered. "They knew what was coming long before we did." Dr. Reeves pointed to the final set of calculations dated to just 3 years earlier, and they've made a prediction. Based on their observations, if current trends continue, they estimate we have less than a century before catastrophic ecosystem collapse, widespread extinctions, climate patterns that won't support current human civilization. The chamber fell silent. We were looking at the accumulated wisdom of a species that had survived by understanding the world around them, and that wisdom was screaming a warning we were only beginning to hear. Over the next few weeks, we documented everything in that hidden chamber. We brought in climate scientists, astronomers, mathematicians. Every expert who analyzed the calculations reached the same conclusion. The Bigfoot understanding of Earth systems was sophisticated, nuanced, and terrifying in its accuracy. But there was something else in that chamber, something that gave me hope even in the face of such dire predictions. Near the exit, easily missed among the technical calculations, was a simple pictograph. It showed human figures and Bigfoot figures together working side by side, and beneath them, a healthy forest, a thriving ecosystem, and above them, a stable sun in a clear sky. Dr. Keating stood beside me studying the image. "It's not just a warning," she said softly. "It's an invitation. They're saying if we work together, if we learn from their knowledge and combine it with our technology, we can change the trajectory. We can avoid the catastrophe." That pictograph became the symbol of the Sasquatch Conservation Council, a reminder that the intelligence we discovered wasn't just academic curiosity, it was practical wisdom that could save us all. In the years since, disclosure, we've begun integrating their knowledge with our science. Their understanding of forest ecology has revolutionized conservation practices. Their astronomical observations have helped refine our climate models. Their sustainable living practices have inspired new approaches to agriculture and resource management. And the young ones, both human and Bigfoot, are learning together. We've established the first interspecies educational programs, human children learning patience and observation from Bigfoot elders, young Bigfoot learning written language and technology from human teachers. It's crude, still experimental, but it's happening. Last month, I attended a gathering at the Northern Reserve. 23 Bigfoot from 6 different clans, and about 40 humans, researchers, conservationists, and government officials. We sat together in a large clearing, sharing food, sharing knowledge. The current matriarch of the Northern Clan, the daughter of the elder who first contacted me, demonstrated their technique for finding water sources using plant indicators and soil composition. A human hydrologist explained how we could use satellite imagery to identify similar patterns across larger areas. Together, they developed a methodology that neither species could have created alone. That's what their intelligence really means. It's not that they're smart in the way we're smart. It's that they're smart in ways we never learned to be. They see patterns we miss. They understand connections we've forgotten. They remember that intelligence evolved not to dominate nature, but to live within it successfully. I think about the young agent I was in 1993, walking into Ray Torres's office and seeing those first photographs. I had no idea that simple carved message, "Stop looking," would lead to 30 years of the most profound education any human has ever received. They weren't telling us to stop looking for them. They were telling us to stop looking at the world the way we had been. Stop seeing nature as something separate to be conquered. Start looking at it the way they do, as the living system we're part of. My granddaughter Emma, she's 9 years old now, wants to be a forest ranger when she grows up. Not to patrol the woods, but to learn from them. She's part of the first generation growing up, knowing that humans aren't the only intelligent species on Earth. And that changes everything. The way she sees animals, plants, ecosystems. She understands instinctively what took me decades to learn. We're not the pinnacle of evolution. We're not the masters of the planet. We're one of many forms of consciousness, each with our own gifts, our own wisdom to share. I'm 71 years old now. I've spent 30 years of my life learning from beings that most people thought were myths. And what they taught me, what they're teaching all of us now, is the most important lesson humanity has ever received. We are not alone. We never were. And our survival depends not on dominating the natural world, but on learning to live as part of it, with wisdom and humility and respect for all the other consciousnesses we share this planet with. That's the truth about Bigfoot intelligence. They're not just smart. They're our teachers, our guides, our hope for a future where consciousness and compassion triumph over exploitation and extinction. And I'll spend whatever years I have left making sure that lesson is heard.